probieren wir das doch gleich mal aus. Guten Tag. Hello nerds, I'm currently very red. I'm in the Monstercat studio. And I've asked my supporters on Patreon what kind of topics they would like to see some videos about. And there have been tons of requests, it's awesome. Some are very specific and some are just about stuff like how do I sidechain? And even though to some of you that might be a very basic thing, I think you deserve to know. So today, let me show you exactly how I sidechain and why some of it might look a little weird at first. So a lot of effects, like a compressor for example, react to the incoming audio. A compressor just lowers the volume of the incoming audio by whatever you set it to. And sidechaining just means that instead of reacting to the audio that it's putting its effect on, its compression, it's reacting to different audio. In this case, just as a quick example, I have a drum loop and a pad here. And right now there's a compressor on the pad that does just what a regular compressor does. It reacts to the pad's volume and compresses it and adjusts it. But instead I could say, hey, compressor, react to the audio from the drums, but apply whatever you hear from the drums as compression to this pad. That is sidechaining in its most basic form, and some effects might not just react to the incoming audio's volume, they might also react to the frequency content, and then suddenly whatever you sidechain it with can dramatically change the sound of the effect. But this case of sidechaining where you use it in the compressor to have the compressor react to something different than what it is affecting is the classic way of how the pumping effect in EDM drums has been achieved for years. But obviously there are other methods to do this and more precise methods because a compressor has an attack time and a release time. It needs a little bit of time to react to the incoming audio's volume, to do its volume adjustment. So there are other ways to do this, for example, just volume shaping. I can literally go and just automate the volume of this pad down whenever there's a kick drum or a snare drum happening here in the drums. This is very tedious, but very precise, and I know some people do it like that, and there's nothing wrong with it. Let me just set this up real quick for fun. Like, that totally works. It gives us a similar effect to when we use the compressor with the sidechain input, but now it's a lot more precise. The volume doesn't react to all these little percussions in the drum loop, so that's a valid way of sidechaining, quote unquote. But to save you from the hassle of having to automate the volume by hand, there are plugins like Volume Shaper. I'm just using Shaperbox, which is the more advanced version with more effects, but I'm just using the Volume Shaper part of it. And here we can make a little volume automation curve and then tell it to just trigger this whenever I have a MIDI signal being sent to Shaperbox. So in my standard project file setup, I have a drum rack at the top that's just meant for kicks and snares, another one for cymbals, then a group for basses, a group for synths, a group for samples, but everything except the kick and snare track here is being sent to an audio track that I called sidechain, which is set to input monitoring. So whatever I send here is just going to the output. For example, this serum here. You can see how the volume meter moves down here as well, because the audio is getting sent from serum to the bass group sends it to the sidechain track is on input monitoring. So beautiful, that works, sound goes through. And same with the massive here in the synth group. It goes from this massive track to the synths group and then to the sidechain group. So everything in my project file, except the kick and snare, has to go through this audio track where I have a shaper box. Now below my sidechain group, there is a MIDI track I called Trigger that has no instrument on it. I just told it to send the MIDI information to the sidechain audio track, and then Ableton immediately detects, hey, there is a plugin here called Shaperbox that can accept MIDI information. Cool. So now I can make a MIDI clip down here, and whenever there's a note played on this MIDI track, it's going to trigger this sidechain volume automation. Here's a quick example where I've got a little loop up here. And now I'm turning on my little trigger MIDI track down here. Nice. This way, this volume automation triggering, or sidechaining, if we still want to call it that, happens instantaneously. There's no attack time that a compressor would have, and I can very precisely shape the release behavior, how fast the volume is supposed to come back up and in what kind of shape. And the other bonus you get by doing it this way, especially with my setup here, if I have a drum pattern with kicks and snares, I'm just going to make something real quick, then I can just take this MIDI clip up here and copy it onto my trigger track down there. I'm just going to make this a little more drastic so it's easier to hear. And then if I decide to make any changes up here, I can just copy it over again to update my trigger track. And voila, I don't need to worry about any complicated automations. This also allows for easy adjustments. Let's say I don't want this volume ducking to happen on the snare, then I can just go in here and delete all the notes that were the snare. And now it'll only duck when there's a kick drum playing. But if you have a keen eye, you might have noticed something strange over here on the right side. This -5 milliseconds thing. So this column over here is the track delay. You can move tracks forward and backwards in time, just so you can hear it if I make this loop late. Now that's out of sync, and you used to be able to make this visible with some buttons down here that Ableton 12 has sadly removed, but you can find this under View, Arrangement Track Controls, Track Options. If I turn that off, whoop, they're gone. Let's bring them back. And this way, I can actually have this volume ducking happen a little bit early, and just 5 milliseconds is just short enough where you don't really notice it. But what it does for me is it makes everything absolutely quiet right before the kick or the snare transient starts, just to make sure there's no overlap and that the drum transients are really clean. In addition to this, in my volume shaper setup, I do give it a slight fade in. Down here, if you look into this bar down here, while I'm moving this point, you can see how many milliseconds away from the start this point is. I can be like, hey, let's set you to about 4 milliseconds. So there's a 4 millisecond period here where it brings the volume down smoothly and then it's absolutely quiet. So that will match up perfectly with my 5 millisecond early trigger, so that by the time the kick and the snare happen, this volume automation has reached absolute zero and everything is quiet and the kick and the snare can come through perfectly. This fade has another very important reason, because especially with bass music like dubstep and drum and bass and all of that kind of stuff, we got a lot of sub-heavy stuff, and I'm just gonna, for demonstrational purposes, make a sub over here. So I've made a little sub, and I've set Shaperbox to just play this back in sync at quarter notes, and now you will be able to hear that if the start of this curve just goes straight down, depending on what point the waveform of the sub is at, if it's like at an absolute high or an absolute low and not in the center at 0, then this straight downwards volume automation is going to create a little click. And we can avoid that by maybe just giving it 4 milliseconds of fade in. That sounds a lot nicer. So back to MIDI mode, and I'm gonna turn my trigger track back on. So not only have we made sure that everything is absolutely quiet right before the kick and the snare hit, but also we've made sure that any loud sub basses aren't going to be cut off and create a click, which might overlap with the kick and snare transient and make it sound weird or cancel it out in a funny way. Nice. So that's all cool and nice, but there is another way of sidechaining that I use in addition to this called Ringmod Sidechaining, and this is going to get a little more nerdy and a little more intense, and I'll try to explain it as quickly and easily as possible. But it is kind of some black magic stuff, and it's really cool, and especially for heavy electronic music, I found it to be a really cool addition to regular sidechaining. So check this out. This is my kick and snare, and this is everything else. Right now there's no sidechaining, no volume ducking happening, and one of the reasons why we do this volume ducking is because if this plays together at the same time, then in the moments the kick and the snare hit, these amplitudes are going to add up and that's going to get very loud. Like you can see, the kick and the snare are hitting 0 and everything else is also hitting 0, so together that's going to clip. So wouldn't it be cool if you could sort of remove the waveform of the snare and the kick from the waveform of everything else? And what would that look like? Well, I can show you down here, because this is the result of removing the kick and the snare out of everything else. First of all, this is what it sounds like. So it sounds like some weird crunchy distortion happening, especially when the kick hits. And if we zoom in, you can kind of see how this is still this, but kind of minus that. Whenever the kick, for example, is at an absolute maximum or minimum, the rest gets really quiet. There's still a little bit of noise left, but it's basically making sure that in the moments where the kick goes to absolute top or absolute bottom, which both still count as high amplitude, the rest gets made really quiet, and only in these moments where there's some wiggle room left, like especially here in the center, this means absolute silence, so everything else can be as loud as it usually is, and this should be exactly that. Yep, that looks pretty much exactly the same, especially at the center. So this process of Ringmod sidechaining is basically modulating the amplitude of everything else, based on the actual waveform of the kick and the snare. Over here at the snare, we can also see there's only little bits coming through whenever there's a zero crossing in the snare. But the fantastic thing is, now if I play the kick and the snare together with everything else, but with this Ringmod sidechaining effect on it, it's not going to go over zero, because it's making sure that everything else is turned down exactly as much as is needed to make sure that together everything never goes over zero. It's removing the kick and the snare as waveforms from everything else in a way. It's not phase inverting it into it. That would then cancel out the kick and the snare. It's just modulating the volume always down to the waveform center, which is zero in silence, whenever there's something happening here on the kick or the snare. Quick listening comparison. This is just regular, playing both at the same time. And now the Ringmod sidechain method. You can definitely hear the crunch that is happening to everything else, especially when the kick plays. But I use this method in combination together with the regular volume ducking. So I'm going to show you how this is set up in my project file. And first, I just want to demonstrate to you that the kick and the snare hit the master at pretty much exactly zero, so right before clipping, and everything else, which is all going through my sidechain track here, is also exactly at zero, because I'm using a clipper here. And obviously together, that will now start clipping. Quite drastically up to +6, and it distorts. And if I turn on the Ringmod sidechain and just play it again, it doesn't clip, the kick and the snare come through way better, and we do have a little bit of crunchy distortion happening, which does sound kind of cool. And maybe we can mitigate that by just adding some shaper box volume automation on top at the end. Maybe this doesn't even have to be like at 100% strength, this could maybe be at 75%. And then with that on top, kick and snare come through like crazy, nothing is clipping, and I think for heavy music, this is a really cool way of doing the whole sidechain setup. So how does the Ringmod sidechain work? This is a little much, but I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible while still making it understandable. So what I have here is an audio effect rack with 3 different chains. One is just empty. This is just letting the sound of everything else come through unaffected. And then another chain that is on has a ring modulator on it, and this ring modulator is getting a sidechain input. Here we are again with sidechain inputs, and this time on something other than a compressor. So what a ring modulator does is, I can just move this out here and show you what it actually sounds like just by itself, without any sidechain input. That's really weird, right? So this is just modulating the volume of whatever comes through up and down at a certain frequency. And that frequency can be really high. If I set this super low to like 20 hertz, you can hear how it's fluttering. But as soon as this goes super high, then you get these weird overtones. So strange effect. Sometimes this can be really cool on certain things, but instead of having this built-in sine wave in this case here, because usually ring modulators always use a sine wave to modulate the volume of whatever comes through. So instead of using that, you can tell it to, hey, use this other audio instead of just a fixed waveform at a fixed frequency. And a lot of ring modulators have some sort of sidechain option. I'm using the Melda M ring modulator, which is free, and I'm sending it the kick and the snare through the sidechain input, but rectified. So rectified means that instead of our waveform going up above zero and then down below zero, it's only gonna be on one side of the center line. I can show you visually real quick what's happening here. So right now you're hearing the kick and the snare, right? And now I'm turning on a rectifier. So that has moved everything to just one side of the center line. But it's important that this kind of version of your kick and snare is being fed into the ring modulator sidechain input. To do this, I'm using M Wave Shaper, which is also free. So in Ableton, you can set this up exactly the same way that I did here for free. The free Melda plugins are really nice and very precise, so for this, they are perfect. And here in M Wave Shaper, by default, this curve just looks like this, and that means input is going to be exactly the same as output. And here I'm saying, hey, anything above that zero line, just fold that back down, and that rectifies our signal. I could look into like the exact technical specifics of what is happening here, but just copy my settings or look up another Ringmod Sidechain tutorial where someone explains it in excruciating detail. But maybe have some plugin around that gives you an oscilloscope like this so that you can check in the end, hey, is what comes out only on one side of the center line. To get my kick and snare here, because remember we're in the sidechain audio track that I have on monitoring, like the thing that everything goes through. But I have my kick and snare here for some reason playing. So how's that happening? I'm using Ableton's compressor. You can do it also with Ableton's gate. And I'm selecting, here we go again, another sidechain thing. I'm selecting, hey, I want to use a sidechain input and I want to use my kick and snare. And then I'm clicking this tiny little audition button here. So this basically just turns off the entire compressor and just lets you hear what the sidechain input is. If I turn this off, then I hear whatever is happening on this audio track and how it's going through the compressor and what it sounds like afterwards. But if I turn this on, this is completely ignored. And I just hear whatever's coming from the channel that I've selected here. So this is kind of a way how to route audio from anywhere else in your project to a certain effects chain. This doesn't need to happen with a compressor. You can also do this with the gate, because the gate also has a sidechain input. And then here you could just go, hey, kick and snare. Just make sure that the gate's built-in look ahead is turned to 0. The compressor also has a look ahead. Just make sure that's also on 0. And then I forgot to turn on the little blue listen button here. And we got our kick and snare. So that way, I'm running the kick and the snare through this rectifier, and I turn off the chain activator here because I don't want to hear that chain. I just need that rectified signal to send it to the ring modulator down here. So now in the ring modulator here, I can say, hey, your sidechain input is coming from the sidechain track, which we're on, but I need this exact chain here. So I can say, hey, okay, sidechain track, and then inside the sidechain track, it's like, okay, there's an effect rack. There are actually 3 things you can choose here, either the chain with the wave shaper, the chain with the ring modulator, or the chain that is down here with nothing on it. So I'm telling it, hey, take the sound that's coming from this chain that has the wave shaper on it, post effects. Post mixer would take into account that I've turned it off or how loud this is. But we don't want to hear it, so I've turned it off. So I got to make sure that here in the ring modulator sidechain input, I say, please take this chain post effects. So it's getting the affected signal at the end of this chain as the sidechain input for the ring modulator. And then that is getting added to the dry signal that is just going through in parallel. And then we finally have our Ringmod sidechain set up and ready to go. I know that is a lot, but I wanted you to know how it works and what exactly is happening. But you can just copy these settings, have a look at this, check that this is where the sidechain input is coming from, have a look over here that this is set up exactly like that, and then you have a gate or a compressor here that has the sidechain input from your kick and snare and has this listen button on. And make sure that that first chain is turned off so you don't hear it. And then you should be good to go. And both of these plugins are free and very precise and work perfectly for this purpose. Lastly, I just want to note that I wouldn't use this Ringmod sidechain method everywhere, since it does create distortion in the signal that you are Ringmod sidechaining. If you had like a beautiful soft vocal and then some soft drums, but you Ringmod sidechained the drums out of the vocal, it might distort it in a way that is not very pleasant, but it really depends on the type of music that you're making. So try it out, maybe it works, maybe it's cool. But yeah, this combination of Ringmod sidechain and then MIDI-triggered volume ducking that is a little bit early and has a slight fade-in is how I do my sidechaining on most of my heavy tracks. That's it from me for today. See you again soon. Bye!